Greetings! I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to show you how I painted these M3 Halftracks. These are Battlefront 15mm scale models for Flames of War, and they're from the old Grimball's Beasts box that I built about 100 years ago. If you want to see that build video, there's a link in the description, and in the upper right corner of the screen now. The Grimball's Beast box is no longer sold by Battlefront, nor do I believe is its replacement, but you can still buy these Halftracks separately, either in a box by themselves, or with a rifle platoon for them to carry. I started this as usual by priming, and I chose to use black primer. In this case it's Stynel Res. I base coated the Halftracks using Vallejo model colour Brown Violet. This is simple enough, just spray the colour all over the model. This is of course thinned appropriately for airbrushing. Building up the colour with a few thin coats results in a nicer, more smooth looking coat that doesn't obscure any details. Then I made a mix of roughly 60% brown violet and 40% model colour buff. I spray this directly down on top of the model, kind of like a zenithal highlighting. You can see this makes quite a difference. I decided it was a bit sharp along the edges, so I gently sprayed this along the top of the sides of the vehicle so that it blends in a bit more. Now it's time for some dry brushing. I made a roughly 50-50 mix of brown violet and buff, and roughly dry brush it onto the upper edges and raised details. I do this fairly roughly. Though I'm obviously focusing on the edges, it is okay if I get a little bit of it elsewhere too. It'll create the appearance of fading and maybe some scratching. Here you can see the difference this makes. The edges and details are a bit more defined on the model on the right. I decided to take this a little bit further and applied a slightly lighter, more careful dry brushing, using a mix of roughly 1 part brown violet and 2 parts buff. The mixes are of course rough. I don't scientifically measure my paints or anything like that. I eyeball it and make slight adjustments to the mix on the fly. This dry brushing is lighter in both colour and application, and I'm trying to pick out only the very edges of things so that they stand out a bit more. And here you can see the difference this makes. I think it looks pretty good, so I don't feel a need to do any more highlighting here. Actually, I kind of want to darken it down a bit, but before I do that, I want to add the decals. I apply gloss varnish to the areas where I want decals. I used Minotaur gloss varnish for those interested. Applying decals is pretty straightforward. I'm not sure if the ones I've applied actually came with the model, I've forgotten, but they are Battlefront decals, so I know that at least they're in the right scale. The numbers on the sides of the engine compartment were a bit fiddly, but they went on okay. This video isn't really about decals, so let's move on. I said before that I wanted to darken these vehicles down a bit, and to do that I'm going to use a wash of Army Painter Strong Tone. This is thinned to about 1 part Strong Tone and 3 parts water, so it's not going to be too heavy. Before applying this I added some matte varnish to the areas I'd previously added gloss. This is mostly to avoid any chance of the wash beading up on top of the gloss. I apply this roughly all over the model where it's going to stay green, which is most of the Halftrack. I applied this after the decals because not only will it darken the paint a bit, it should also create a slightly dirty look, and applying that over the stark white decals makes them look much more like they belong. Then it's time for some chipping. Doing this after applying decals and everything else also helps to blend them in. This is the same old sponge chipping technique that I usually use. The colour is roughly 60% model colour black grey and 40% model colour mahogany brown, and it's dabbed on with a sponge. I expect this is what the kids mean when they talk about dabbing. For more about this effect, check out my video on it, link in the description and in the upper right corner of the screen now. As I usually do, I follow this up with some scratches. I do this with a fine brush and the same colour mix. Just paint some very fine lines. Do be careful though, you don't want them to be too wide, otherwise they just look like paint. I try not to go too overboard with these scratches. I feel like they look especially good where they cross a decal. Next, I paint the steering wheels. I decided to use AK Interactive rubber tyres for this because, well, they're rubber tyres, aren't they? This is obviously pretty simple. Put the grey on areas that are tyre and try to avoid areas that aren't tyre. I used the same colour on the tracks. I believe the tracks on these M3s were rubber and not metal, so using this colour made sense to me. It means I'll also be skipping the track wash and stuff like that I would normally apply to metal tracks. I'm being careful here to try and avoid painting things like the drive sprocket, road wheels and suspension gear. It is okay to make mistakes though, you can always come back and touch things up. I felt like the outer surfaces of the road wheels and drive sprocket should be a little bit darker, if only to add some interest and variation. I painted those areas in Vallejo model colour black grey. The difference here is a bit subtle, but there is a difference. Again, I try to avoid getting this on the outside of the wheels. Also, don't forget to hit that little return roller up there. I use the same colour on the whatever this roller is called, the bit that helps the half-track climb stuff. I roughly streak this on, I'm not trying to coat the part in the colour, I still want the green and chipping colours beneath it to show through. I then add a highlight to both the tracks and the wheels. I used model colour London Grey here, and dry brushed it on with a small dry brush. Nothing too tricky. I don't go too heavily, and I apply it mostly to the upper surfaces where there would likely be light hitting it. Next, I figured why not paint the gun. Here I used model colour gunmetal mixed roughly 50-50 with model air black, because I liked how it looked on the Blitz Germans I painted last month. This obviously goes on the gun. I'm careful to paint around the ammo box and the mounting part, which should stay the same green as the rest of the vehicle. One of my half-tracks has a winch, so I paint the cable in that winch with the same colour as the gun. I feel like that makes sense. And don't forget the metal parts of the tools. There's one on either side. The axe here, which for some reason I painted the upper part of the handle metal too, and the shovel on the other side. I carefully paint both the main body of the shovel, either side of the bar that holds it into place, and on the top of the blade bit. Simple enough. I go slowly to avoid accidentally painting this onto the areas that I want to keep green. Then I painted the wooden handles with Vallejo model colour beige brown. As you can see, I use a fine brush and I'm going fairly carefully, trying to apply the colour only where I want it. We can touch up mistakes of course, but it is nicer to avoid making extra work for ourselves if we can. The shovels should be a metal colour at the top of the handle where it curves. I forgot to paint that, so I had to mix up some more of the gunmetal and black and apply it here. It's a tiny area to paint, but it's not too bad if you're careful. I then paint the seats. I decided to use some Vallejo khaki. This is in an old Flames of War branded bottle, but I'm pretty sure it's the same as the model colour variant with the same number. This being the inside of the vehicle makes painting the seats a little bit fiddly, but it's not too bad. Just make sure that you put the khaki on the seats and not the bits that aren't seat. I have no idea if the seats are meant to be this particular colour, but I did see a picture of a half-track with the seating in a very similar colour, and I thought that would add a bit more interest than painting them a darker colour or leaving them the same colour as the rest of the vehicle. Then it's time for some touch-ups. I made a mix of roughly 50-50 brown violet and buff, and I mostly apply that to the wheel rims, the wheels in the track sets, and the rim of the steering wheel. This is mostly just to touch up areas that I accidentally put grey on, but it also adds a nice kind of highlight and makes those areas pop just a little bit. Not only do I apply this to the wheels, but it also went on some areas around the gun that needed a clean up, and the brackets that hold the jerry cans and the tools. I waited until now to apply these touch-ups rather than after each step so that I would only have to mix the colour and apply it once. Next, it's time for some washes. First, I applied Army Painted Dark Tone to the tracks and steering wheels. This was thinned roughly 1 part water to 2 parts dark tone. I apply it fairly roughly. It should nicely darken these parts down just a touch and add a bit of colour variation. Then I make a mix of strong tone, roughly 50-50 strong tone and water. I apply this primarily to the seats. I try not to get too much of it on the green areas, but a little bit around the seats is fine. It should add some depth and hide any tiny bits of roughness around the chairs. I also apply this to the tool handles and the floor of the passenger compartment. And then I apply another coat of gloss varnish. This is to protect the acrylics from the forthcoming enamels. First, I thinned out some AK Interactive track wash to about 50-50 with white spirits. I don't need this for the tracks, but I figured it would look good on the rollers on the front of the vehicles. It adds a very slightly rusty and dirty look to them without going overboard. Next, I take AK Interactive Dark Brown Wash for green vehicles. These are green vehicles, so this should work well enough. I'm mostly trying to get this into the gaps and recesses on the vehicle. It doesn't really matter if you get this on the flat surfaces at this stage, as long as it's in the gaps to help darken them nicely so they stand out a bit. Then I use a clean brush with clean thinner on it to remove the wash from the places I don't want it. This adds to the kind of dirty look of the half-tracks without going too far. At least I don't think it's too far, and I guess what I think is what matters because they're my models. I apply another layer of gloss varnish to seal that in. And then I spray some AK Interactive Dark Mud. This is thinned probably 1/4 dark mud and 3/4 white spirit. I used an envelope as a shield when spraying this. The idea is that this will help keep direct spray to the lower areas of the vehicle, though I do hold the envelope far enough away that there should be a little bit of overspray. That way I won't be creating a defined straight line along the side of the model. That would just look odd. I don't use the shield at the rear because I figured that area would accumulate a lot more dust and dirt all the way up. I'm pretty satisfied with that, so I don't add any more dust colours. I could call it complete, but first I need to install the driver figures. I painted these when I painted the Grimball's Beast Infantry figures. If you want to see that video, there's a link in the description and in the upper right corner of the screen now. It was easy to glue these into place with plastic cement. The bottom of the figures where they were held for painting by Blue Tack has meant the plastic was nice and exposed there, and I scratched a bit of the paint off the seats with a knife. Simple enough. I generally don't like adding people to vehicles, but I figured this wouldn't be so bad. They should kind of distract from how little detailing or painting there is in the driving compartment, and I think that's a pretty good reason to have them there. I finished the job by applying a nice coat of AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish, and it's done. 5 Flames of War M3 Halftracks in 15mm scale ready to take some infantry on sweet rides. Now all I have left to do from the Grimball's Beast set is the Shermans. I'm pretty happy with how these M3s have turned out. They're more or less exactly how I wanted them. Clearly they're kind of simple. I mean, there's only so much complexity you can add to a coat of olive green paint, really, and they're not exactly covered in tools and stowage. There aren't even any mines in those mine racks. If it was a big issue to me, I would have added some extra stuff before painting. At any rate, I feel like what is there adds interest and breaks up the colour enough. There's no need to overcomplicate things. I'm also pretty happy with the dust. I managed to not go overboard with it, which is something. Clearly it's not a muddy vehicle and I didn't want it to be that way, but it still looks like it's been used a fair bit. I think in 15mm scale it's better to sort of just hint at dirt and mud unless you want it to be really, really muddy. Sometimes that looks cool, but in general I prefer my vehicles to lean towards the cleaner side of things. I think these should look pretty good on the table alongside their infantry and the Pershings I did, and eventually the Shermans too. And I think these would also be suitable for carrying around my British infantry. That is, whenever I get around to actually acquiring some British infantry. Sure, they say USA on the sides, but whatever, you can't stop me from using these with my Brits. I think having the driver in these adds a little bit of interest too. Somebody on Discord mentioned that they don't like these plastic drivers because they don't have a steering wheel, and I'm inclined to agree there, though it's not super noticeable unless you happen to look really closely. Either way, I think they look fine. Pretty much nobody's going to be able to tell when they're on the gaming table. As to having no passengers, maybe they've already been dropped off and the half-track is moving out of the way or something. Personally, I think it looks fine empty. That's one of the great things about models. Everyone can build them how they like them. I say this a lot, but I don't think I did anything extraordinary or revolutionary here. It's just a basic paint job, so I see no reason why others shouldn't be able to achieve similar results. If you're interested, there's a list of the colours I used down in the description below. Feel free to follow that if you're painting some half-tracks too, though I do like to encourage people to make their own colour choices. Either way, I hope this video has been helpful to someone in some way. If you have any comments, feel free to post them in the comment section below. And if you've painted your own half-tracks, why not share pictures of them over on my Discord server? We've got an excellent little community there and we'd like to see your models. And if you haven't already, why not sub here on YouTube, follow me on social media, or watch me stream on Twitch. And if you really like what I do, please consider supporting over on Patreon or perhaps by purchasing a shirt or mug from my merch store. Links to all of those things are in the description below. And as always, I shall return soon, so until then, be excellent to each other and thanks for watching. Farewell.